I say welcome to this webinar. It's the second one I'm doing for ESL, which is Joe Lasorza's new company, where him and I are trying to get a company going that has focus on executive protection operations all over the world. And as part of that, working with international vendors and international operations is part of that. This is a topic that has always been a great passion of mine since the start of my EP career. Wasn't in the US, it was actually in Denmark. And I've personally have had the pleasure of working all over the world. Just to give a little bit of background for this speak here today. Over the years, some of you guys might know, but I used to be with a big company called AS Solution. And before that, I was with another company called West Security. That was a Danish EP company. And between those two and what I do now, I have operated in about 120 countries around the world. Just to put that in perspective, there's about 190 countries in the world. There's no set number for how many countries there is because it always varies a little bit about what we recognize and what we don't recognize. And 15 of these countries are pretty much no-go zones. And a lot of other countries doesn't have a lot of business. So have been working in 120 countries is one thing, but I've also guided all the guys that used to work for me that has worked in a lot of different places around the world. It has given us a lot of lessons learned. And some of the things I'm going to talk about here today is purely from my opinion and from the lessons that I've learned and from what I've seen that worked for us. That doesn't mean that it's the way. It just means that it worked for us, and this is my experiences. So there can be plenty of other ways to do things. And I always say more power to that. It's really all about making our clients happy and safe. And if they're happy and safe, well, then what people are doing is probably correct, right? So don't kind of like take it too set in stone what I'm saying, because these things are all based on best practices for us and our experiences. For the last people to come in, welcome. Christian West here. We're about to start. What I'm going to talk to you guys about today is all about international operations. And it's probably going to be a webinar that I'm going to do a couple of segments of, because it's really such a wide topic. And there's so many things to think about that I can't do it all here today. I'm planning on keeping this webinar up somewhere between 45 to 55 minutes, depending on how it goes. So I hope I won't steal all of you guys' Friday. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today is what's on the screen here. I'm going to talk a little bit about where the clients are planning to go. How does that affect the vendors that we need to help us? How do we vet these people who might come from the other side of the globe? In some countries, it can be very, very hard to vet people if they don't have like a licensing system or they don't have a vetting system or whatever. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how much vetting is really necessary and why do we do this. And the other thing we talk a little bit about here is licenses and insurances. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about my real passion, and that is how do we secure that we get really good quality from the people that we work with. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. You know, when we talk about international operations, it's kind of a very wide area, because technically international operations is when we go to another country. And obviously, if we just take what's landlocked with the US, going into Canada can be very different than going into Mexico. And if we expect to go to Mexico, we kind of know that we're going to get one level of service. And if we go to Canada, we're kind of going to expect to get a level of service that's really, really close to the US, because the country way of life and stuff like that is pretty close to the US, right? And a lot of times it's kind of funny to me, because it's one of the things that we can easily forget when we talk about international operations, right? Because a lot of times I see people that want to work with vendors and want to go around the world working with companies out of Europe, um, working out of or companies coming out of Europe that they want to use for operations in Asia, or they want to use for operations in Africa and so on. And in theory, there's nothing wrong with that. You just gotta remember what it is that you're asking to do, right? So as soon as we talk about international operations, the first thing I'm always asking people about is, okay, where are your client going? Okay, how does that affect your EP operations? If you run a 1 or 2 man detail in the US, you can probably get away with running a 1 or 2 man detail in most places in Northern Europe. And in some places, let's say in Africa, India, the Middle East, or whatever, you might want to step it up a little bit. So it's important that you kind of look at where are we going, how does that affect the operations, what do we need? Do we need to step it up? Do we need to tone it down? Do we need different aspects to support our clients, right? And that takes us into looking at the agenda that the client have, right? If it's a multiple country agenda, if it's a agenda that has personal elements and business elements, if it's an agenda that is fully packed, is it an agenda where they pretty much just go on a trip and play it by ear, right? That really affects what kind of support we need. So once we know those things, right, I usually make it really, really simple. And I like to speak in paper format. So if you can imagine your bullet pointed out, you ask yourself, where does the client go? How does that affect the EP setup that we have? What is the client's agenda? How does that affect the setup that we have? And what level of support do we need when we go to these places? And is our clients okay with that, right? Once we have figured that out, you can kind of start asking yourself, okay, what do we do, right? And there's one thing that I always challenge people with, because no matter where you go, you will most likely need some kind of a vendor support. And when I say vendor, I don't only mean security companies. I also mean limo companies, cars and drivers, interpreters, EOD dogs, if you need that, TSCM, halls and walls, whatever you need, right? When I speak of this, I speak in general vendors as whoever they are. And these vendors can be hired by us. They can be hired by a company that we work with. They can be hired locally, or they can work for the corporation or the clients that you're already working with. But at the end of the day, what we will be talking about here is typically people that either we hire or a security company hire for us. Because if it's somebody that's already working for the client, we might not have a big say of who we're choosing and what they're doing and all of that stuff. So when I speak about vendors, it's typically people that are within our control when we go internationally. When you go internationally, there's really 2 ways that you can do it. A lot of us have contacts around the world. You met them at a conference, you know them from previous trips, from previous work, you know them from training classes, whatever. You can reach out to them directly and you can set it up. And that's one way of doing things. Another way you can do it is you can hire what I call a multi-service company, which is companies like the ones that I ran, where you can come to us and we'll help you find the vendors and manage the setup in the different countries. And you kind of go to us and then we give you the setup, right? 2 different ways of doing it. There's pros and cons with both of them. And I'm going to talk more about that when we get into it. There's no kind of set ways where you can find vendors, right? It depends a lot on how much international travel do you do. If you work for a client that does trips all the time, and they might have different level of EP programs, typically the bigger corporations, they typically go to a security company that then can service them worldwide at all the different locations, where people who don't travel as much have a tendency to more reach out to different countries directly, right? And there's no set ways of doing that, but a great way of doing it is going to conferences, using, of course, online resources to find vendors around the world. And there's no right or wrong way of doing that, as long as it works. And this is a quote from the second book, no, actually from the first book that I wrote with Brian Jansen, where we talk about there's no right way of doing or finding your vendors, and it doesn't really matter as long as your clients get a good experience and you have a good experience and you feel good about how you've done it, and we keep our clients safe, then we're all good, right? So that's one way of looking at it. But when you think about international vendors, right, there's a lot of things that kind of jumps in that you need to figure out. First of all, you need to figure out where you're going. Okay, what vendor do I want to be using? If you go directly, you got to make sure that they're available. You got to make sure that they're available before and they're available after, because everybody who's been doing this for a while knows that nothing is set in stone. So you got to be ready to kind of go a little bit earlier or go a little bit later, depending on the agenda. You got to make sure that they're available for your advanced work. If you're lucky enough to get and go and do advanced work, you got to make sure that the actual vendor is available for the advanced work, because what's the point of doing the advanced work if you don't have the vendors with you so they can do it with you, right? If you don't have the cars and drivers for the advanced work, what's the point, right? You need to be able to run the routes. You need to be able to find your way around. You need to be able to go out and check out hospitals, airports, all the other stuff that you do. So availability is pretty much an obvious thing. The next question that always comes in is vetting, right? And vetting to me has always been funny, because I don't know if you guys have seen on a lot of these LinkedIn groups or Facebook groups or whatever that we're all on. You see somebody ask, I need a security company in Thailand. And there's about 25 people that jumps on right away and say, work with this person, work with this person, work with this person. And I'm always thinking to myself, what does the people that say that base that on? If I have a client that I work for and I know pretty intimately and I have a relation with and I worked for years, right? And I go out and I ask people, do you know anybody in Thailand? And they say, oh, I know this guy. He's great. My next question would be, where do you know him from? Oh, I went to a training class with him. You know, that's great. And that means that you went to a training class and you sat next to him and you guys went through the exercises and you guys probably went out and had a beer and you bonded, and he seemed like a really squared away guy. For me, that's not entirely vetting the people. It's a start, right? But there's more to it, because what does this client or this guy you met at this training class, what does he actually do? Does he work for the government there? Does he have an EP company? If he has an EP company, what does this company do? Do they do cars and drivers? Do they do executive protection? How much of it do they actually do? Was he just nice when he was on the training class? Did he say all the right things? Did he buy you free beers? What happened? Or did you actually dig into it and ask him about what he does and how he does it, the protective mythology, all of these other things that this company live and die by, right? If you met the guy, you probably have a feeling for it. But if it's somebody that you may not know yourself on the internet saying that, hey, I love this guy, he's really good, and you should really use him in Thailand, does that really mean that this guy know this guy and have worked with him? Or does it just mean that he was at a training class with him somewhere, or he maybe have gotten him recommended from somebody else, or maybe he's a fanboy, you know? that has read his posts online and have really made this impression that this guy and these guys in Thailand are great. Several times myself, I have come to countries and the vendors that we're supposed to work with, that we're supposed to have vetted, and they're supposed to be so and so good, shows up, and I go like, what the hell? Where did these people come from, and what do they do, right? And it turns out that our vetting wasn't good enough, right? There's no manual for vetting people. So when you go in and you talk about vetting, it's pretty important that you figure out what matters to you. What kind of footprint does your client want? And when you go out and you find these vendors that you're going to work with, does they fit the profile that you want for your client, right? Because liability is kind of a two-prong, right? When we talk about liability, there's always the liability of something going wrong and all of that stuff. And that's important that we vet for that. But you also got to remember there's also the liability of you keeping up the work with your client. There's one thing every time we go outside of our normal element in executive protection and we either take a recommendation or we make a recommendation or we hire somebody based on that, we stand the chance of screwing up, and that can affect our clients. And there's a lot of liability based on that as well, right? So of course you got to vet them. So you check all the boxes for the liability that we normally think about, but there's also your personal liability of keeping the clients and keeping the work. And you got to remember that at the end of the day, you fought so hard to keep this client happy. So you don't want somebody else to kind of screw that up for you. Then there's the whole licensing part that's always important, right? And it's important, don't get me wrong, licensing is a big deal. But at the end of the day, you're going to be in the country for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. So licensing is one of the things that you need to check the box on, but you can only do so much. If they send you a certification saying that they're licensed in this country, a lot of countries you can't call a background check on this. It takes time to get an answer back. And if you have to call like the police in my home country where I'm from in Denmark, and we have systems and registers and everything for everything, the police won't just give you a list of licensed security companies. And if they do, you have to request it on email in writing. And it typically takes a while for you to get it back, right? So if you want to do the check of the licensing, you got to be out early. And it's one of those things that's really hard. So you got to make up your mind if you trust the people and the documents that they potentially send you that says that they're licensed. One of the things that I always say that we can do as a minimum is if we work with cars and drivers or car and driver services, is at least to figure out that drivers have a current driver's license, right? And we can do a check that says that the cars are licensed to drive and they can take pictures of their license plates and all of that stuff. So we can do a lot, but we're not sure that we ever going to check the box completely unless you work with somebody who hopefully can do this for you because they do it over time and they keep it up running. And that's one of the things sometimes when you work with a company that does it for you, where one of the pluses are. The other thing that you got to figure out before you go there is, what is my quality? One of the things you'll notice when you go around the world, and I'm going to be talking about this, so I'm going to come back to it as well, is executive protection is a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I don't know if any of you guys remember a couple of years ago when the Turkish president was here in the US, and there were some demonstrations outside wherever the Turkish president was meeting, and his EP team took it up on themselves to go out and beat up some of the protesters on live camera. Probably not something we would do with an American client, but you know where they come from? That's kind of normal procedure. So if you were to go to Turkey and you got a recommendation for a security company down there that help you out, I wouldn't expect you to get kind of like the hands-off white glove service that we're used to here. We go to a different culture where white glove service means different things, right? So it's very important that you figure out what is the quality that you want, and you let people know that this is what you're looking for. Then there's the other thing that's always hard, and that is that unfortunately, when you reach out to security companies around the world, they're not always responsible or responsive. Sometimes it takes time to get answers back. So when you go out and you find the vendors you want to work with, it's pretty important that you remember that these guys have to have time to get back to you. And you're always on a time crunch in EP. If I know my boss is going to Turkey in a month, well, then I would love to have the security company that I'm working with or the cars and drivers logged in at least 2 weeks before, right? So that means I got 2 weeks to find them. Then I got 2 weeks from we have agreed with them and we have agreed on the price and all of that stuff where they potentially can send us the documentation that we need. But what if they don't send it, right? All of a sudden your timeline has lapsed on you. So you've got to go with people that are responsive, right? A lot of things that I see people do is they take recommendation on the internet as these people recommended them, so they have to be good. I really trust them because these people recommended them. And all I'm saying here is when you do your vetting and you do your liability and you do all of this, remember the people that give you these people has to be people that you trust. Because if you don't get this right, all of this could potentially backfire on you, right? Because the minute that you go and do international operations and you're outside of your normal element, all the fuck-ups will always come back to you. There's normally nobody else you can wipe it off on, right? It will most likely be your fault, even though it a lot of times ain't, right? The other thing that you got to remember when you go overseas is everybody has a nice website. Everybody has a nice brochure. But truth of the matter, there's very, very few companies, even in the US, when you think about it. And the US is probably 100 times bigger of an EP market than anywhere else in the world, right? When you look at what I lined up here, and there can be many other services that we need. How many companies can actually provide cars and drivers, support agents, advanced work, event staff, horse and walls agents, TSCM service, EOD dogs, protection dogs, interpreters, and the list can go on and on and on. I mean, I have had clients where when we travel to other companies or countries, they need doctors on standby, that wants ambulances on standby, that wants all kinds of special services, right? A lot of times you have to juggle 1, 2, 3 companies that help you with different services. So it can be very, very hard when you want to go out and select these vendors to figure out who you're going to use. But there's one thing that I've learned, or there's a couple of things that I've learned over the years, and I made my checklist when I teach my agents that now travels for me. And some of the things that I always tell them is that we cannot expect them to be mind readers, right? So when I had to bullet point it out a little bit for this seminar, the things that came out to me is always that it's on you to be very clear on what you want, right? And just to give you guys an idea, we can all agree that the US culture is one thing. If you just go to a country like France, who's for the most part pretty civilized, I mean, they're still French, so maybe not so much, but most people think that the culture in France and the culture in the US is pretty compatible. And it is for the most part. But if you take something like you go to a restaurant and you order a Diet Coke in the US is typically a big glass full of ice, and you pour Diet Coke into it, and they refill it all the time. That's how we see a Diet Coke. If you go to France, a waiter brings you a small bottle. He brings you a glass where he put maximum of 2 ice cubes in, and he poured half. Then he leaves the bottle, and then he walks away. When that is empty, you have to order and pay for a new one. Something as simple as a Diet Coke is so different. So how do you think it is to buy EP services or car and driver services? If you say, hey, I come to Paris on Monday, I need 2 cars, 2 drivers, and 1 support agent. you can be 100% sure that you will see two drivers that are only there to drive. Their job is to drive the car. They might go out and open the trunk for the client, and they might open the door, but they will not lift the luggage unless you ask them to do it. And they will probably be smoking before the client arrives. So there's a chance they're going to smell of smoke. There's a chance that they do all the things that's totally normal in their culture, unless you have told them otherwise, right? So they're not idiots if they do these things. They just do what they normally do unless you manage it. That's why one of the biggest things I always tell is be very, very clear of what you want and what you get. And that's why we do advanced work, but I'll get into that. Culture is different, and it can be very hard for us to understand, because when we look at it on the internet and even when we go there, we kind of feel that our culture is the same. But it's not always the same. There's always the little nuances that makes the difference, right? And another thing you'll find is, and I guess the best example is if anybody has ever worked in India, most people that works in business that we would be in contact with in India speaks understandable English. And if you ask them, they also understand English. But when you talk to them, it'll be pretty clear for you that they speak some kind of English and they understand some of the English that you're saying. But it's not always that they understand everything you're saying, but they might not tell you that, right? So be aware that speaking English and understanding English is not always 100%, even though people tell you, because in a lot of places, it's kind of rude to tell you that you don't understand. So you always have to kind of like break it down and check it, right? And also, if you communicate with vendors around the world that comes from a company, be aware that a lot of times it's the company owner, the company manager that picks up the phone and answers the emails. It's not the agents, it's not the drivers, whatever. So there can still, even though they were good in when you hired them and when you talked to them and whatever, they said all the right things, they did all the right things, but is it actually the agent that you're getting that did all this, right? So there can also be another pitfall. And then there's our professional understanding, right? If you look at how we do executive protection in the US, it has a certain look to it. It has a certain choreography to it. It has a certain way of doing things, right? If you talk to people from Israel, for instance, who has great EP teams, but an EP team in Israel, if you look at them on TV, they typically have their shirts untucked. They all have their sunglasses typically up on their forehead, and you can kind of tell they look a certain way. If you see them on TV, you can see that they typically live in an environment where they need to be really close to the clients all the time, so they have a tendency of gathering up and run their formation really close to the clients. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how it works there. If you don't tell them that you want it in a different way, their professional understanding of executive protection is very different from yours. So it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. Be very, very clear about what it is that you want when you go to another country, because else it can be very, very hard for them to kind of guess what it is that you want. A lot of times, if I work with new people around the world, I go as far in my advanced work to ask them, if I'm the client, where would you position yourself and why are you doing that? And then I kind of break it down either on my iPad or on paper or whatever and say, no. This is what I want, right? The same with the drivers. And the drivers is even a different story to manage, because typically they're so close in with the clients that if they do kind of like dumb stuff, everybody will see it right away, right? It doesn't mean they're idiots. It just means that they come from a different culture and a different way of doing things. And it's super important that we remember that. Here's an example from a real life details. I took these pictures in two different places, right? This one to the left is actually a detail in Zurich that I was watching while I was sitting at a cafe. And when they came out, they were literally waiting for the girl's boyfriend or whatever to come up, and they stand in a formation like that. But apparently, it must be normal to them because the client seems to like it. If I presented this to my clients, well, that would be I would probably have some explaining to do, right? The other thing here that I took is a picture that kind of looks at a detail that came to CBS, right? And it's actually been out published many times afterwards and stuff like that. And we look at a detail that obviously is driving a bulletproof car and all of that. And what these guys are doing is very different from what I do, right? So even in the US, we have so many nuances in executive protection. So if you go to these countries, and you know, a lot of the countries are pretty sophisticated. So if you go to a lot of these countries, it can be very hard for them to understand what it is that we're trying to do unless we're really, really good at telling them or explaining them. So if you think about that for a second, they probably don't know your style of protection, so explain it. On top of that, even if we know how we want to do protection, do you really know your principal? Have you worked for him many times, or were you just hired to take them overseas? Well, then you have even more of a challenge, right? Because if you don't work with the clients all the time, how do you know? So you got to figure that out first, right? Americans call it executive protection. There's a reason why the rest of the world calls it bodyguards, right? It's two different things. In our world, executive protection is what we do in the corporate world. It's kind of the more refined one. For us, bodyguards are typically working celebrities or touring or whatever. And we all think back to the older days where a bodyguard was a big guy that would walk in front and push people out of the way. That's not entirely true. Actually, bodyguard is one of the few universal words that's understood all over the world, right? So what we refer to as executive protection will typically be bodyguards. A lot of times when you come to a vendor around the world, and I know this from when I had my small company back in Denmark, right? When an American detail came to Copenhagen and they hired us, we really wanted to do the best that we could, because this was one of the richest people on the planet or one of the most famous people on the planet that came to our little country. We really wanted to do well. So a lot of times it's easy for a local vendor to be a little over the top because they want to shine. They want to do everything they were taught by the military, the police, or the schools, or whatever. And they want to impress, so you hire them again, right? And that's why it's easy for a lot of these companies to be a little bit over the top, right? And a lot of times, if you don't have clear expectation as a vendor, they don't always understand their role, right? Because if the role of the guy you hire is just to be a local kind of representative for you, to have a license, to be an interpreter, to be with you so you can find your way around, but not really be part of the protection program, well, then you got to tell him that. Tell him to wait in the car, tell him to stand over there, tell him to back off, or tell him to be with you, or tell him to go with the advanced guy. Else he might not know, and he misunderstands his role, right? And the other thing that you'll hear a lot when you go around the world is like, no, you don't get this. This is how we always done it. Or no. This is how we do it in Turkey. Fine, I get it. But you know what? My client comes from Silicon Valley. He's super young. He made all these money and he doesn't like security. So I don't want you to do it that way. But sir, don't worry about it. We've always done it like that. This is the way that it's done here. You might have to sometimes even be a little hard on these people. And that's why the next bullet points here I have is so important. And it's one of the things, if you don't explain and set expectations, it's very hard for people to give you what you want. You got to make sure that they understand your expectations. One of the things that I've seen a lot when I used to send out agents all over the world that would work internationally, and we We had an operations center where they could reach back, and once they came back, they would write their after action report. And if something had gone wrong, they would always say, well, the local agents that we hired or the local cars and drivers, they were really bad. And then I would go like, how were they bad? Well, they didn't drive really well. And I go, but you were there for 3 days. How come you didn't change them? Oh, because I didn't want to throw these guys under the bus. Oh, so you rather drive with a bad driver than speak up and get a new driver? Well, I didn't know I could do that. Well, it's on you, buddy. At the end of the day, if this driver is unsafe, he's not following your directions, or he's not doing what he's supposed to do, and you don't have a good feeling about it, you need to be a leader because you're there doing your advanced work. What is the advanced work for? The advanced work is for us to be sure we can get from A to B in a safe and effective manner, right? It's really all we do. And then we're there to prepare for potential emergencies, right? But the emergency starts with the driver not being able to drive in the way you feel good about. I might have hired a company from here in Vegas where I'm sitting today to support you in Italy if you work for me. But if these guys send me a driver that's new or nervous or have an off day or the wife just left him or whatever, it's on you as the advanced guy to be a leader and speak up and understand what advanced work is really for, because it's on you. If you don't fix it, nobody will. And it's going to come back on all of us because the client is going to get a very, very bad experience out of that, right? So I hope if there's any takeaways of what I'm saying here is that if you go out as the advanced guy, you have a chance to fix that detail. And if you have, let's say, 3 days for advanced work, if it's a big trip, I usually told myself that if I don't feel good about my support on day 1, I have a different tone in the morning of day 2, where I kind of go, hey guys, we need to figure this out. I need you to drive this way. I need you to act this way. I need you to look this way. I need you to represent me this way. And if we start the advanced work in the morning and they haven't gotten it by lunchtime, it's time for me to make changes, right? Because if I have a 3-day period, and I'm just speaking figuratively, if you only have a 1-day period, you kind of got to have to do it the same way, but it's a little bit harder. So on a 3-day period, the first day is the learning day. The second day, half of the day, they should have it by then. If not, it's about fixing it, making the changes or whatever. So I have the third day to run it again, right? Because they all need to know the routes, the hospitals, the airport, whatever. So it's about you understanding the timeline of advanced work so you can work with the people you have and make them up to the standard that you want to be at. So I usually tell people when they go out, understand what advanced work is for. Don't take what you get for granted that it works. It's up to you because it's going to shine back on you if it doesn't. It's always your responsibility, right? And I think it's always easy to blame the subcontractors. It's always easy to blame the car and driver services. It's always easy to blame the local. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. You can always change them afterwards, but you can't come back to the client and say, yeah, I made a really shitty choice of vendors to support me in Turkey. Sorry that they beat up some people outside the venue and that was hosted by your company. I promise it won't happen again next year. I can promise you probably won't be going again next year, right? So it's super important that you manage expectations and you make sure that you get the deliveries that you really want. Okay, then people always turn around to me and say, all right, Christian, you always talk about these things, but I really only have 1, 2, 3, 4 days for advanced work. There's never enough time for advanced work. And I go, no, I get it. It's super hard. But one of the things that you can do that I don't see a lot of people do, but I always speak about that, is put down the guidelines in a simple form that you want people to act on. Put down the bullet points for how you want the drivers to drive. Put down the bullet points for what you want in kind of like the inside of the car. If you don't tell him not to put his lunchbox that might smell of whatever his wife cooked that morning or the day before in the side pocket of the door, you gotta tell him, right? But it can be hard for you to tell him that if he didn't do it the first day when you did the advanced work, but he does it on the second day because his wife cooked some really good food the night before, right? But if you make a checklist that you go over with the driver saying, nothing that smells in the car, no food, no whatever. You gotta look like this. If the client asks for something, don't just answer, let me answer, and then I ask you if I don't know. You put down all the bullet points. It's a lot easier for you to brief them, and you don't forget about it. And if you're really good, when you already talk to the owner of the company or you reach out to them to book them, you can send them the guidelines already and say, this is what I want, right? So I usually tell people that you should have a set of checklists or a set of bullet pointed guidelines for everything we need. If you need halls and walls agents, you gotta give them an instruction for how do you want it. If there's any vendors on this call here, I'm sure a lot of you guys have gotten a call that says, hey, can you guys provide 2 guys to sit in the hotel lobby while our client is in town? And a lot of you have gotten those directions and no more. And the guys show up and they have no idea really what to do. And a lot of times the agent that is supposed to brief them ran out of time because advanced work kind of ran away from them. So they don't have time to brief them completely, right? But if they had a checklist, you could say, hey, I want you guys to be here at that time. This is what I want you guys to do for coffee. This is what I want you guys to do for toilet breaks. This is what I want you guys to pay attention to. This is what I want you guys to do these and these and these things on. And if you have pre-written it down, you can kind of brief them faster and you can expect that you get a better service. And more importantly for you, you don't forget to tell them, right? Because every time, no, I wouldn't say every time, but probably 90% of the fuck-ups that I've had around the world with hired services has been because either mine or my guys' briefing wasn't clear enough, right? Maybe we gave it, maybe they didn't understand it, but at least let's start there, right? And that is really how you secure what's most important, quality control, right? Because if you take it for granted and you just give them a loose briefing and you're not clear about what you want, how would you get it, right? When you think about it, it starts with us. And at the end of the day, if we don't ask for it, we're lucky if we're buying it. I hope all of this makes sense. And I know I talk a lot. So I hope that you guys got it and kind of get what I'm saying. This is the end of this webinar. If anybody have any question, the chat is open. I haven't looked at it so far, so I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, but I'm going to look at it now. But in general, I hope you guys got something out of this seminar, and I hope that you guys are going to join us on the next ones. Joe and I are trying to do 1 or 2 webinars about different EP-related topics every month. And if you look at social media, if you look at our website or whatever, you should see what it is that we're talking about. And I hope you guys will join us, and I hope we can get some good dialogue and discussions going. On the website, we have our contacts. You guys can reach out to us there on social media. If any of you guys have any special questions from me that you don't want to put in the chat or whatever, you guys are always welcome to reach out to me. My contacts, I'm going to write my email right here. So if anybody has any questions from the webinar that you don't want to put out in public, you guys can reach me here, or else I'm going to mute myself and say thank you for tuning in, and I'll answer the questions if there is any in the chat.